First off, I want to thank everyone for coming to Stratacore's Compliance in the Cloud event, and I also want to thank ViaWest for hosting our open bar. Everyone, please take advantage of that.
Thanks once again to everyone for showing up tonight and joining us in this, what will certainly be a lively discussion around compliance. I just want to introduce our three panelists here. Jason Carolyn is the CTO of ViaWest and is responsible for the strategic direction of products and technology initiatives. Prior to ViaWest, Jason had nearly 20 years of experience in leadership positions in both small startup companies and large Fortune 100 enterprises, focused on product architecture, product management, and technical sales. His previous roles include over 10 years at Sun Microsystems, where he was a distinguished engineer in network and systems architecture, focused on cloud computing and data center architectures, and also director of cloud services engineering at VMware. Jason is the lead author of one of the first books highlighting the combined use of virtualization and automation. He also has several patents in networking, data center resource management, virtualization, and security. Jason, you want to tell us a little bit about ViaWest?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Lee. Make sure I'm on here. Can you hear me? Check, check, check. Check, check, okay. So yeah, ViaWest, if you don't know ViaWest, we're headquartered in Denver, Colorado, and we are a national infrastructure as a service provider doing cloud managed services and co-location. So like sort of Lee and Jay said, we help a lot of our customers that they know they need some IT solutions, but we engage with them at an architectural level, make sure we've got the right solutions for them, and bring them into one of our data centers. We've got 27 data centers across the United States, and it's a very growing portfolio with lots of services like our compliance as a service offering that we just launched at the end of last year to really help customers proactively manage this sort of growing world of compliance complexity that I'm sure we'll probably talk about today. So thanks, Lee. Happy to be here and happy that we can buy you drinks. And I would say if we say anything good up here, you should buy us drinks. Just text and we'll do shots.
We're actually going to be running back and forth to get the drinks during the session.
This is way cool.
Thanks, Jason. Adam Schneider is Vice President at Coldfire Systems. Adam has extensive experience in audit planning, enterprise risk management, and information security. His experience includes serving clients in compliance efforts for a variety of technologies and cloud environments for HIPAA, PCI, FISMA, FedRAMP, FFIEC, GLBA, and SOX. Mr. Schneider has served hundreds of clients by delivering security implementations and audits utilizing PCI, CISP, SDP requirements, COBIT, ISO, FISMA, FedRAMP, NIST, and proprietary methodologies. Adam has also assisted clients in designing and implementing information security programs and architectures for a variety of industries, applications, and platforms, including emerging technologies such as mobile, virtualization, and cloud computing. Adam holds numerous industry certifications, including CISSP, CISA, CISM, and he's also a payment card industry qualified security assessor, QSA, and has his Bachelor of Science degree from the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State University.
The Ohio State
Thank
University.
You.
Adam, tell us a little bit about Coldfire and what you do there.
Great, thanks, Lee. So Coldfire is a professional services organization strictly focused on information security and compliance. I think Lee read off all of these acronyms above us, and we focus on all of them, helping our customers become compliant, understand compliance requirements, and generally build and understand what they need to do from a security and compliance perspective. We also do a variety of complementary services around penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, application code review, application validation, all related to security and compliance. So, and again, we're happy that ViaWest paid for the drinks, and we appreciate that.
Thanks, Adam. Dan Franklin is our last panelist. He's a segment manager at Verizon Edcast. He has over 13 years of experience working in the tech industry with large and small sites on application acceleration, content delivery, site optimization, and mobile delivery. He has a strong focus in online commerce and a background in software engineering that has allowed him to become an expert in how sites can improve in performance, scalability, and security. Dan has played a large part in helping many online retailers to optimally deliver content locally, globally, and at a massive scale using CDN, DNS-based load balancing, PCI, SSL, mobile device enablement, and more. Dan, you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on at Verizon Edgecast?
Sure. I went to University of Wisconsin, so I can
Badger.
offer Big
Typical.
Ten support, although I grew up in Michigan, so I
Oof,
barely
oof.
acknowledge Ohio as a state.
This is going to go downhill, guys.
Barely,
This
yes.
is-
There's a table between us, so it's for
Start
the best.
videotaping because
Right.
this is going to go viral, I think.
Right. I'll keep the words small and short for it. So, anyway, so I've been at Edgecast for about 2 years. Right at the end of 2013, we were acquired by Verizon. So we are technically Verizon Edgecast. I don't even know if there's a slash in it or not. And we're a global delivery, a global CDN. So the main offering that I really focus on is really aimed at commerce sites. So it's a global platform that's level 1 PCI compliant. It does site acceleration, it does content caching, it does mobile device enablement. Pretty much anything that an online commerce site needs to do, we can help it do. We also do DNS-based load balancing. We offer a whole DNS product, and probably that'll help the conversation. We're about to come out with our web application firewall and a lot of our DDoS mitigation offerings actually that are going to beta this month. So that'll hopefully be rather important to this conversation.
Thanks, Dan. All right, well, I was thinking back to my first experience with the compliance world. We had a small managed hosting client, and they did payment processing for nonprofits. So processing millions of transactions, and a number of years ago, it came up that, hey, we need to be PCI compliant. You know, what do we need to do to make this happen? So back then, you know, we said, well, let's take a look and get to understand all of these requirements and how we can fulfill them, and what sorts of hardware we need to put in place to make all that happen. And you know, we put out 5 servers and a couple of firewalls and a web application firewall, and started mapping to all the different PCI specs, and thought we had it all nailed down. Had Coalfire come out and do an audit for us, and turned out that we were close but not quite, and you know, I think our backup was through a backnet that needed to be secured as well, so we had to throw a third firewall at that problem in order to be truly compliant. This was a good 7 years ago or so. But nowadays, it's no longer necessary. You don't even need to own your own hardware. You can go to the cloud and still be just as compliant as we were back then. So I think I want to start it off by asking the question, what's changed in the past few years to enable all of these applications to be compliant in the cloud instead of having to throw stacks of hardware at it? Jason, you want to kick that off?
Sure, thanks. I think certainly there's a level of maturity that helps, I think, helps everybody understand the different things that need to come together to make something compliant or secure. And I think it is interesting to have a conversation about what the difference between compliance and security, you know, are or is, and is something that's necessarily compliant, is it secure? I think you look at the target breach that everybody's probably heard about, you know, over the last 4 or 5 months, 150 million cardholder, you know, data and their PIN, you know, stolen, presumably from their HVAC network that was somehow bridged to their, and somebody here might know more about it than I do, but HVAC network that was bridged somehow to their point of sale network. And they were probably compliant from a PCI perspective, although I hear that if you're breached, you're no longer compliant or something like that. So what has changed? Well, I think we understand technology more. I remember when I was working at the Mayo Clinic, we didn't use VLANs. You know, VLANs were, everything had to be an air gap. You know, I think some of the air gap issues have gone away. I think there's multiple reinforcing technologies now. You know, anywhere from the physical layer to the hypervisor layer to the traffic paths that all come together to really provide a lot more data, a lot more compensating control, you know, information, and just a lot more. You know, you feel really good about the platform. You can see the data. You can understand where it is. I think it's just really important to be in a place, whether you're building it yourself or whether you're helping somebody's helping you do that, to make sure that there's just a lot of transparency. And I think when we do an audit, you know, we share that information with our customers. we're fairly explicit in how we share blueprints and really discuss the data traffic and the traffic paths with them so that they can feel comfortable with it as well.
Great. Adam?
Yeah, so a lot has changed. Number one, several years ago, there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? A lot of unknown. What can we use this? How is it secure? How do we move into this space? And I think that's been overcome in a couple ways. Number one, cloud service providers and AKA hosting providers, whatever you want to call them, and assessors have come together, as well as the vendors that support the virtualization that exists in the cloud to educate, define reference architectures, explain how segmentation within a virtualized environment can be done to allow multi-tenancy to be secure and to be segmented and to provide the layer of protection that they expected in a physical world to exist in a virtual multi-tenant world. And then I'll also layer on top of that the guidance from regulators has come out, especially if we talk about PCI and the federal government, through the PCI white papers and the guidance that's been provided through the virtualization white papers. They came out last year with an actual cloud white paper to explain and give guidance to assessors and to cloud service providers and to the merchants and service providers that wanted to leverage them on what should be expected of a cloud service provider and how to properly manage that type of offering and allow multi-tenancy and allow technology to prevail in a world where everybody is afraid to use it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a number of those things put together that has changed, and it's the maturation of the industry until the next big topic comes up, and we go back to fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and the maturation starts all over again.
Right.
I think too, along those lines, you look at the sort of the amount of data that's out there and also how people access it. I mean, anybody in this room willing to admit they don't have a smartphone? I'm assuming everybody here does. You think about 2007 or whenever the iPhone came out. I mean, that was such a game changer in terms of just how you're accessing data. I think, when I think of PCI, it's, who doesn't shop online now? When I think of HIPAA, my dad's a doctor. He went, with electronic medical records about 10 years ago because of cost. I mean, it's just as a small practice, he couldn't afford to have, dozens of years of files sitting and also who had access to that data. So I think a lot of it has to do with the amount of data out there, who has access to it, and who wants to have access to it. So I think as technology changes, like you were just saying, as technology changes, there's more stuff to think about.
Great. Thanks a lot. By the way, this is a pretty informal get-together, so if anyone's got questions, feel free to raise your hand, shout out, whatever you have to do. And,
On the payment card issue, I understand that in Canada they don't use the type of credit cards that we do. And when is that going to change over in the United States? Would that change everything as far as PCI?
So that's true. So as far as card present, so moving away from the cloud discussion, card present transactions, most, I'll call them civilized societies, don't use the mag stripe to do their payment. Europe, Asia, and Canada, our neighbors to the north, all use the chip and pin. It's an embedded chip. It is a requirement. All of the acquirers, all of the organizations that are processing our credit cards are already set up for it. They were required at the end of 2013. 2015, October, I think, September, October of 2015 is when all merchants are required to start taking chip. We'll talk. I'll caveat the PIN part in a second, but except for pay at the pump, they have good lobbyists, so they have till 2017 for pay at the pump. So the PIN part. So the whole idea of chip and PIN, if you're not familiar with it, and I'll go on a tangent here for a minute, is I put my card in. They call it dipping it into the card reader. You type in your PIN, that unlocks the chip. It takes the data off and processes it just like I swiped it. And it's a fraud deterrent, right? I have the PIN, I can prove I have the PIN, I typed it in. Without that, you're not going to get my credit card number. In the U.S., there's still discussion on whether PIN is going to be required or if signature is still enough. So the usefulness of it may differ than how we've seen it in other organizations or other countries. But it's 2015 that the EMV technology is what it's called, is going to be required in the United States.
Is that required, like you said, accept? Does that mean there's a transition period where it's required versus they need to accept it?
Yeah,
Or is
so
it actually fully transitioned?
October 2015. So they can accept it now.
Got it.
October 2015, I think it's October, it's late 2015, is when it has to be adopted by the merchant environment, all of the
But they
brick
can
and mortar
still
stores.
use MagStripe.
All of them
Yeah.
will fail back to MagStripe. So I'm sure there are schemes where they make the chip not work and then they fall back to the MagStripe, and there's attack vectors and all that stuff that need to be considered, and risk of not doing business, et cetera.
Do you see cost? I mean, think of, a small mom and pop shop, whether it's a dry cleaner, whatever, it doesn't
Yep.
matter. I mean, what they're paying their payment processor is probably an exorbitant fee anyway. So do you see that really cost is the biggest deterrent to that?
To transitioning? Well, in theory, the cost should go down because in countries that are doing chip and pin, usually they get relief if they require the chip and pin because it's a lower fraud rate.
Got it.
Right? So there's less risk of fraud in the EMV with chip and pin scenario. So the transaction, the initial cost, they have to get the device that'll support it.
Sure. And
But
that's-
in the long run, their transaction costs go down. And one thing to note is that this whole technology is only good at card present, where I'm standing in front of the person at Nordstrom or at Starbucks and they're swiping my card. It doesn't apply to anything e-commerce related. That's still the credit card number with your CVV or that 3-digit or 4-digit number. It's only if I'm in the store actually swiping my card.
Are you going to need some sort of shielded wallet, like RFID?
It's actually not RFID. It's well, at least the basic chip and pin. Now they're coming out. They all have the tap to pay, which is RFID. Or it could be RFID. It could be NFC. Thank you. I couldn't think of the acronym. But the basic chip and pin is it's a hardware component. There's no emission that comes off of that.
And by the way, our highly advanced, technologically advanced neighbors to the north, when you whip out your card and
they look at
ask
you
them
funny.
to swipe it, they kind of look at you like you're a bit of a barbarian. So
Yeah.
just be prepared for that, when you head up there.
It's a welcome to our planet. as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm looking forward to not getting those glances. So let's talk about what's new in compliance. HIPAA Omnibus, PCI 3.0. Jason, maybe you can tell us a little bit about HIPAA. What's new and exciting there?
Sure. Well, HIPAA, big changes in 2013. The agreement from HIPAA and the high-tech rule set really went into kind of hardcore protection of data with fines and enforcement, and really changed the structure on how what they call covered entities. So if you're a hospital, you're a clinic, you're a covered entity, you've got to have what's called the business associate agreement with your partners, your providers. And that BAA, business associate agreement, can be very generic. Sometimes when you go pull them off the web and they're protecting you at a cloud provider, they look like a BAA, but they really don't say a lot, and there's not a lot of protection there. Or they can be very specific, which then calls out the exact responsibilities that everybody's going to take and who's going to do what. Which our preference is to do one that's very specific, so that everybody understands their roles and responsibilities. So you've got to have this in place, and just to talk a little bit about the fines, I think a single incident, and I forget, is there a threshold for the incident?
I believe so.
I think there's 50.
Yeah, I don't have a memorized.
I think 50 pieces of PHI released, I think, has a fine up to $1.5 million, and that's per incident. So, and that's levied by the federal government onto a provider, levied by the federal government onto a covered entity. So it's very broad. But it's sort of the first case where it's really the federal government that's doing the protection and the fining here versus PCI and other stuff is really more of a civil side, or some state governments have their own requirements as well. So it's a big change in certainly the HIPAA space.
And potential criminal penalties for willful loss as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Adam, what's going on in PCI? We've got something new coming up here.
Can I talk HIPAA too?
Oh, sure. Let's hear a little about both. Why not?
So just to extend on the HIPAA piece, we're seeing with Omnibus a lot of confusion around who is a BAA, and we're seeing that they're just calling everybody a business associate because they're worried that they're going to get sued. Coalfire, as an assessor, has been asked to sign business associate agreements, and we never touch EPHI ever as a rule. And we never collect it, we never bring it back to our office. We get some network information usually and system information, but so that's the thing that everybody's trying to figure out. You can talk to two different lawyers that have read the omnibus rule, and you'll get two different interpretations of who's a business associate. So that's a big deal, and we deal with that every day with our clients on who to include and who not to include as business associates. And now I'll transition to PCI. So PCI 3.0, it is technically effective now. It became effective January 1, 2014. It is not required until January 1, 2015. So if you're got a PCI assessment, try to get it done before the end of the year, and you can do 2.0 still. But PCI 3.0 changed, number one, they changed a lot of the structure to consolidate and improve the redundancy that existed in prior versions of PCI. And then they made some broader changes. They added some physical security requirements, especially for organizations that have point-of-sale devices, to better inventory them, to understand where they are, what the devices look like, identify tampering of those devices. If you remember Michael's, they got a big breach because somebody added on or swapped out some card readers for card readers that had an overlay that was swiping the credit card and taking that track data, that mag stripe data off of it. They made some enhancements, I'll call them, to how they've written some of the password management requirements. The password management was very prescriptive. It's still prescriptive, but they got softer in allowing other creative methodologies for managing passwords and still maintaining the same level of security. Cloud service providers, one of the big things that's going to affect a lot of cloud service providers is if you have a multi-tenant environment, you must have a way to separate accounts across your client base. So I can't have a single administrative account that gets me to every one of my customers, because the risk is if I can get to every customer, if I breach that admin account at the cloud service provider level, I now have access to everybody. They've given guidance around that may include maybe not a different account for everyone, but maybe using the cloud service provider moving to a two-factor authentication mechanism where they're required to have a password and or a PIN and an RSA key fob, or some sort of one-time password that's sent to a cell phone or somewhere else. So they've given some guidance around that, but that's one of the biggest changes for the cloud environment and the cloud providers, so that you know that if one of your customers was breached in the cloud, not all of them are necessarily at risk. Those are some of the big changes. Like I said, there were a lot of structural changes. They moved policy requirements into the individual requirements instead of just having one broad, don't forget about policies section. But that's the big stuff in PCI 3.0.
Great, thanks. Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about how these changes are going to affect
Sure.
Edgecast?
I say we've sort of been on both sides of that equation. I call it the rubber glove treatment, because the auditors come in and really get up there. So it's really around. I'll let you soak that in for a second. So at Edgecast, the platform that we have is level 1 PCI compliant, and we're really a technology provider. So we don't store credit cards, we don't process them, but they flow over our platform. So we went out and built a totally separate platform to be just PCI compliant. So it has its own customer portal that has two-factor authentication. It has, there's a web application firewall, which is an extension of PCI as well. So it's really around, I think that the parts that I know best are really the steps we had to go through with our audit in order to have this platform be certified as PCI compliant. And really, as a technology provider, we really want to be a checkbox. We don't want to, we're not going to, we don't make our customers PCI compliant. They can't sign up for Edgecast and all of a sudden they're PCI compliant. They have to go through that audit.
They'll claim they are.
Right, and you know, I've had people say to me, well, if we use you, do we still have to go through our audit? And yes. And so it's really around, like I said, as a technology provider, you just want to be that checkbox that says, yep, we're PCI compliant, Mr. and Mrs. Commerce site, when you're working with your auditor. And I view a CDN really as an extension of architecture. We're out there at the edge, we're serving all of your customers. A data breach on our side would be probably just as catastrophic as a data breach, you know, within Target or within, you know, whomever is running the site. So we've had to put a lot of safeguards in place around who has access to that data, who can see that data, and then obviously the umpteen different requirements of what we had to do with this. I think our letter of attestation had, you know, like 60-some pages associated with it of all the stuff we had to go through in order for it to be PCI compliant.
It's a short rock. Most of ours are 120.
Oh, well, we got lucky, apparently.
You know, the things, what we found is that, you know, looking at both HIPAA and PCI 3 is that there's a lot of similarities. You know, and almost like now with PCI 3 defined that you can now back into HIPAA a little bit easier because PCI is so prescriptive. HIPAA is still fairly left up for interpretation, which isn't the easiest sometimes. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But how do you see, like, you know, are more customers looking for a standard like an ISO 27K and mapping different compliance requirements to that?
They are. So we have, especially cloud service providers, we see a lot of our cloud service providers in general, is a big community that we serve, and we do a lot of what we call a consolidated audit program. And we take, we'll either start with a framework if they already have one, or we'll take the compliance requirements. Coalfire has their own common controls framework that's based on NIST, HIPAA, PCI, and then it bakes in ISO and some other stuff. And we use that as a starting point and strip out the stuff that isn't important or isn't necessary really for compliance. But we do a lot of crosswalking of compliance requirements across each other so that you can do a single assessment, get multiple reports, and at the end of the day, tell your clients that the cloud service provider clients that we've met all of these different requirements. And if you go, if you have an environment that is going through the federal government requirements for FedRAMP, that's what you want to talk about prescriptive and, you know, the rubber glove treatments. That's as bad as it gets, right? It's very intense, and that one crosswalks to about 90 to 95% of all of the other requirements out there. There's always nuances, but it is very comprehensive in the way FedRAMP goes. So if it's a cloud service provider that's going through FedRAMP, we've crosswalked that against PCI, HIPAA, FFIEC, Gramm-Leach-Bliley. So
Great.
yeah,
So
that's becoming more and more common.
a lot of interesting changes, a lot of crossover between the various regulatory requirements. Question up there?
Yeah, so talking about infrastructure as a service, which I think is the part more successful of the cloud. If you look, PCI, SOX, and all these regulations, and for compliance, most of them are related, to the infrastructure. So I think, the burden, to be compliant is less about us, more about the providers. So can you make some comments about how we should, work with cloud providers, that they are compliant, what are the implications for us right now? For that, because in the past, if you have your own data center, you need to do the whole thing.
Right.
If you go to Amazon Web Services, many of those things is not about me and my application. It's about Amazon or any of you guys.
A question about where the demarcation point of responsibility is between customer and service provider. Yeah.
Right.
So
What does that look like?
I'll start, and then maybe Jason has some insight, or Dan has some insight on how they communicate with their customers. So one of the things that we do with our customers that are cloud service providers and our customers that are using cloud service providers is we expect to see some sort of responsibility document. This is actually another change in PCI 3.0 that extends the requirements of making sure they're compliant to if you're using a cloud service provider or any other third party to do your storing, processing, or transmission of cardholder data, they're going to be required to tell you exactly what requirements they cover. And that way you can identify what your responsibility is versus their responsibility. So today, there's various levels of that documentation. Some cloud service providers have nothing, and they just say, hey, here's our attestation that says we're compliant, leave us alone. And then you have others that have copious amounts of documentation. We've written 100-page documents to go with our report on compliance for PCI that explains requirement by requirement what the cloud service provider owns and what the customer's responsibility is, so that it's very clear what the expectations are. So as far as understanding responsibility, it's a key topic that we talk to every one of our clients about. And in fact, we would recommend you find an organization that is going to be transparent about who owns what, much like Jason was saying with HIPAA, where they're very clear in their business associate agreement of whose responsibilities are what, is doing the same thing with any regulatory requirement that's up here, not just PCI, not just HIPAA, but across the board, so that you understand and they have some understanding of what their responsibility is. And I don't know if you guys want to chime in.
Dan, how do you express that demarcation point with your
I say, fortunately, we have a report on compliance that we can share, and part of and most of our responsibility really does end there.
Right.
I mean, as I mentioned, since we're not processing those cards, we're not really at the mercy of some of these things. But on the flip side, I mean, when you look at applications, I mean, whether it's the target data breach or there's obviously the Heartbleed stuff that's been in the news that I know, Lee, you want to touch on in a few minutes. Edgecast is really platform agnostic. We don't really care if you're using a homegrown e-commerce solution, IBM, Magento, whoever. Obviously, but there are also limitations to these platforms where if a developer comes in and there's some bad code somewhere that just leaks out data, or you look at SQL injection attacks or all these other things you can do. We don't really control the application. So some of our responsibility is fairly limited, and that's also written to service agreements too. But yeah, we do have a report on compliance that we can share with customers.
One thing you named at the beginning, security and compliance is not the same thing. So you can have an unsecure application that is compliant. I think it's very important,
What we do is we'll sit down with the customer and actually draw, what we call a data map, right? So trying to figure out where data is in transit and where data is going to rest. I think that's, if you look at a lot of just the rule sets around all of this and a lot of the best practices, it's really about data. Where is your data? How is it going to be transmitted? And then to go sit to Adam's point, you create a RACI around who's doing what. I imagine there's a lot of people right now trying to figure out, well, who's supposed to be patching my server that has the Heartbleed issue, right? And so if you don't have a document that sort of says that's what you got to do, right, and who's responsible for what and what the timelines are, I'd be having a conversation with my SP. But at the end of the day, it's all about good deployment architecture, good application architecture, and being able to draw a picture, which is better than anything else, to say this is how my data is coming in, this is where it's moving to, this is where it's going to sit, this is where it's going to be backed up to, and making sure you've got a comprehensive solution.
And just to your point, the difference between compliance and security, what I usually tell my clients that want to just focus on compliance is compliance isn't security, but a good security program will lead to compliance. So focus on security and then weave in the compliance requirements into that, because if you go the other way, you're only going to get halfway to where you want to be.
Fantastic. Quick question for the audience. Is the texture drink functionality working okay? We
haven't gotten mine yet.
Haven't been hacked? Yeah. Okay.
Something copy.
I'm pretty sure it is a PCI compliant application, so I think
So
we
put
should
your
be
credit
safe.
card number in that text.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about, and I've taken a poll on this, and this is working with people in the state government. And HIPAA's been around a long time now. And so 15 years ago, I asked this question, and today I asked the same question. These are people in IT. See, it works. I asked the question, have these folks in IT actually been given any training in HIPAA? And the answer has been no for the entire 15 years. So the question I've come up with now is, has anybody made complaints about this? And if so, is the federal government doing anything about it, or are they just ignoring the complaints? Supposedly to be compliant, you have to have training. Or because the IT folks are part of this, they should get the training. But they're not getting any training from what I can see, at least the state level and the county level as well.
So training is a part of compliance efforts? Is that how we?
Something you'd audit against, I would think, right?
Yeah. Part of our when we do HIPAA assessments, we definitely look at, is there a security awareness training program in place within the organization, at least in the parts of the organization that manage the systems or come in contact with the PHI. So it just depends on who's doing your assessment, or if it's internal resources, they might not be using a framework that is specifically looking at security awareness training, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it seems like the IT folks are getting ignored. I mean, the nursing folks get it, the rest of them don't. And I guess my major question is, there must have been complaints over this 15-year policy to the federal government. Has anything been done about it?
Are you talking about training that comes out of like the OCR for?
You can't look at a patient's individual records or nothing.
So the federal government doesn't take responsibility for training anybody on anything. They just put out laws and tell you that this is a law and you must comply with it, and it becomes the organizational responsibility, whether it's a state government or if it's a private company, to comply with those laws, right? It's kind of like if I'm speeding and I don't get caught, was I really speeding, right? If I'm not HIPAA compliant and nobody steals my data, am I really not HIPAA compliant? So the federal government, as far as I know, doesn't and won't give training on now they do. They would probably sit up here and argue with me and say, look at all of this community meetings we've done and all of the open forums and town hall meetings, and they would probably argue that they are trying to get out to the community, but we're talking about 300 million people in America that they have to get this out to, right? And so they do what they can, but there's nothing broad. They just make sure that people are aware, and then whoever is doing your internal HIPAA assessments should be looking at what you're doing, and they're probably training the people that are day-to-day hands-on with the PHI. But you're right, IT, they go, oh, well, we forgot that everything's in the system, but a lot of things we hear is we trust them, though, because they already have the admin password. What's training going to do, right?
So Jason, your experience at Mayo Clinic was the same? You know?
Well, it was a long time ago. Well, but it was, yeah, I'm old.
Ham on 5, hold the Mayo?
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising. I'm almost just sort of like, is there what's the Whistleblower Act, in terms of, where I guess this stuff should be, right? Because it is, it's kind of scary. You're saying there's a state government, the IT people aren't getting the training around information security just as a whole, right? Which is bad, just not even worrying about compliance. But, we definitely did. We had annual training. I mean, I know for my own company, we've got a learning management system where I've got to go prove at least 90% of my staff. And there are classifications of people, right? So some people have more access than others. And you might actually know more about this, but I think there's also a classification for janitors and people like that that's a little bit different, because they have a lot of access, right? You think about the physical access that somebody cleaning your office has, and you're leaving all your documents on the table. So there's different aspects in who has access, but it seems like it should be taken more seriously for sure.
Great. Well, hey, great questions. Keep them coming. Thought it'd be good to hear about a few customer challenges, some specific use cases, and how some of your clients have implemented your solutions, and interesting conundrums they've come up against. So Dan, you want to give us an idea or two?
Sure. We you know, at Edgecast, we sort of compete in a very interesting space. I mean, there's a very large provider of CDN technology out there, Akamai, who you've heard of, great. If you haven't, you use them every day. You know, it's very interesting. I mean, they're truly like the IBM of the CDN world, where they've always worked. They're the biggest player in the space, and I think getting customers to switch, some of it, and this is probably no different than a lot of different technologies, is really apathy. And actually, I think this translates very well to sort of you know, security and compliance too, where to your question, I mean, I think of not just HIPAA, and I will answer the question specifically in a minute, but I think of, you know, we have system administrators, we have, you know, software engineers who have access to data. You know, there's absolutely nothing stopping, or actually, and you know, there's nothing stopping them from walking off with that. And previous to Edgecast, I worked at Akamai, and actually we had someone arrested for selling secrets to a foreign government. So there's challenges there, at least from a service provider perspective, I think, to your question. So I don't think it's just HIPAA, I think it's everything. And I think some of the challenges our customers see, you know, we have, Edgecast is architected in such a way, we have 35 POPs, so points of presence around the world. We don't have people who sit in front of those POPs every day with, you know, machine guns guarding them or anything like that. So there's obviously, you know, whether any CDN, any service provider, I think the challenge is trusting that service provider is doing what they say they're doing. And hence that's where some of the PCI compliance and these other compliances come into play. I think that some of the big challenges we have are, you know, if a customer's never used a CDN before, it's understanding why you need one and the benefits. We do a lot of things around DDoS mitigation, which obviously falls very much under security versus compliance. And I mean, I've seen everything from, hey, we just got a phone call from the Ukraine saying that they're gonna take down our site if we don't pay them $50,000 in the next 2 hours, to, you know, we're getting hit, you know, 1 million times a second by some, you know, botnet script. What can we do in order to mitigate that? So I think a lot of the challenges that online sites see that are obviously different than what Adam has been saying is really around how do I protect myself from all the bad things that are out there? And there's a lot of bad stuff. There's, you know, everything from Heartbleed, that's just really bad, to you know, obviously, you know, foreign governments. There, you know, the U.S. I'm sure does it too. There are a lot of foreign governments who are really out there doing malicious things online. I mean, it's the vacation hotspots of the world. You know, Iran, Iraq, North Korea. I mean, all of these. I'm
Did
sure.
you just suggest that the U.S. is attacking other countries?
I'm sure they do it. Actually, and Akamai, and
Wasn't me.
And I won't even bash Akamai, obviously, as a former employer of mine. They put out their State of the Internet report, which shows where actually a lot of attack traffic comes, and the U.S. is generally number 2 or 3 on that list. Now, that may not necessarily be the government sponsoring it. That might just be my 15-year-old cousin who's really bored during spring break. But it's, you know, you look at the different types of attacks that are out there, and I think that's generally what, like, a distributed architecture, which is what we are, really helps to solve, is we act as a buffer to those things. We, you know, whether it's someone just hitting your site 1 million times a second, whether it's a much more sophisticated attack, whether it's DNS-based, there are a number of, you know, SQL injection, cross-site scripting. There's a lot of nasty stuff out there, and I think those really, at least from a commerce perspective, that's what sites are seeing today. And a lot of people will never, you know, no one's ever going to admit that they underwent a DDoS attack. That's bad for business, but that stuff's out there, and I think those are really the challenges that we see.
Adam?
Yeah, first I'd like to go on record and say that was Dan Franklin that suggested that the U.S. government does anything malicious.
For
In
anybody
case
who's
the
listening,
NSA
great.
gets this videotape, it was not Adam
Are you
Schneider.
kidding? They're listening on our
drones
phones
are
right now.
coming.
What does it matter?
Drones are
Great.
coming.
Yeah, duck.
Yeah.
And funny enough, PCI 3.0 is going to require armed guards at every physical location. So
Good
get
to
ready
know.
for that.
Right.
They're not. That was a joke. before I go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question just with curiosity is, like if you take a system like the New York Stock Exchange system, that's a New York Stock Exchange is a privately held company. To basically protect that sort of exchange system and do the reporting to the government and all that sort of stuff, what kind of rules and regulations do they have to abide by, or what do they have to do on their cloud system?
Well, I don't know if they would classify themselves as a cloud because it's private and we don't know where they manage it, right? So it could be a private managed environment. So and I don't know what regulatory requirements they fall under. It's probably a host of financial institution requirements and other federal reporting requirements, but I don't know exactly. But I'm sure there's some level, there might be, I mean, we've talked about FedRAMP, they might have, because they have a contract or have some connection with the federal government, they might have FISMA. It's similar to FedRAMP. It's a security, it's NIST-based, NIST 853 as a security control framework. Something along those lines they might have to do, but I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. So challenges that I see are with moving into the cloud for organizations is much more tactical than what I think Dan was hitting on there. We run into questions with HIPAA about data destruction. If I delete a database, how do you make sure that it actually is destroyed? Commingling of data. What happens if you're subpoenaed and there's a subpoena for data as a cloud service provider? What happens to that, and how do you respond? Even all the way to, hey, I see on your list of responsibilities that you don't own IDS into our environment. You own it for the general infrastructure as a service. So how do we get IDS into our environment when it's a PCI requirement, right? Those are the challenges we see, is delineating the responsibilities and then finding the gaps in maybe technology solutions that are out there today to support them, and becoming compliant and how they work around those gaps and responsibilities. And so it differs depending on the level of responsibility, whether you're using an infrastructure as a service, a platform as a service, or a software as a service. And so it really just, software as a service, you have the least amount of issues usually because they say they own everything and everything in the stack is compliant. And so it's a lot simpler usually in a SaaS environment. Platform as a solution gets a little bit simpler because they manage stuff, but then there's questions that we come across around encryption management, whether it's HIPAA or whether it's PCI. How do you encrypt, or even the banks, right? How do you encrypt that data? How do you protect it at rest? Things like that. So much more tactical issues is what we come across.
Have you seen, and sticking with our state government idea, I mean, you know, here in the U.S., online gambling is illegal. I've dealt with customers who do online gambling, and they specifically don't want their data to hit servers in the U.S. And
Sure.
you see country-specific laws.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do a lot of work, whether it's security or we also do privacy work about what jurisdiction is my data in, and so that because of local laws and regulations. So absolutely, I mean, and that's where you have service providers that will tell you pick where your stuff goes, and then you have other ones that say we won't tell you, right? It goes into the cloud. Ooh, right? We don't know what that means for some of them.
I was impressed by Dan's comment about distributed computing, because that's the scientific definition of cloud.
Right.
And I cannot get that concept across to people in the state government. They don't see that. They think of it as internet or something else. So, can you comment on that?
I'm just happy you're impressed with my comments.
I know, he didn't say he was impressed with anything I said.
Hey,
A lot of ongoing
offended.
confusion around the word cloud. That's
so that
for sure.
$20 I slipped you earlier is good, right? So, I think clouds, right?
Sure, you never met me.
Right, sure. Thanks, Dan.
Doing a background check on both of you right now.
That's my cousin. No. So I think cloud's an interesting term, and I think this is what you're asking. When you say cloud, it is sort of a nebulous. I think it's meant to be a nebulous term. That there's this thing called the internet, and that's the cloud, and what you do in the cloud, and you hear, I mean, there's so many, big data is obviously one that I'm not a big fan of in terms of actual terms. But I think when you look at this idea of really, and whether you want to call it infrastructure as a service, I mean, there's Amazon Web Services, Google has its own offering, Microsoft has its own offering called Azure, which is actually served by us now. And so, when you look at really this idea of offloading your infrastructure, which is like what Amazon Web Services does, versus what Edgecast or Akamai or a true CDN does, we own our own infrastructure. We don't own our own cloud. I mean, we leverage the public internet. And at the same time, you're just utilizing our hardware to serve your content. You still maintain this data center, whether it's your own data center or Amazon. So I think this definition of cloud is meant to be, is ambiguous for a reason, because it's just, it can mean a number of different things.
But you're a cloud provider just like Amazon is.
Exactly.
In the sense that Amazon owns their hardware,
Yep.
and they offer out their hardware as a service, or even Via West offers out their hardware
Right.
as a service. You maintain, you're not, and there are a number of software as a service or platform as a service, or maybe it doesn't fall into a category, much like a CDN, that are starting to host in the cloud, right?
Sure.
I mean, you have Netflix, right? They're probably one of the most popular AWS clients
Sure.
on earth, and they've publicized it. They're a software as a service, essentially, right? Or a CDN, call it what you want.
But I think
They've,
that
they've actually built their own.
Right, exactly.
But
And-
in that case, I think actually Netflix is it's a nuance here, but I mean,
Right.
I think Netflix is a distributed computing platform.
Right.
I think a lot
But
of
running on another cloud service
another
provider.
cloud service provider.
Right.
Cloud, I mean, infrastructure as a service, there's a lot of what I would just call throw my application over the wall and it just sits in a VM.
Right.
And that's cloud, right? Doesn't do anything with distributed computing, because distributed computing is really more of an application architecture to go distribute load and do application architecture in a way that's going to get you results faster or more broadly or whatever the formula might be. I think that is, there's a lot of confusion, I think, on what, just in terms of when we survey customers and we say the word cloud, you can just tell you've got some customers that are still trying to figure out how to go outsource their email, and that's really important to them. You've got other ones that are trying to figure out how to do desktop as a service or Dropbox or Box.net, and that's really important to them. You've got other ones trying to figure out how to do application architecture like Netflix. So it's really, it runs the gamut. So it's like the word grid back in the day, right? Which was, you spent more time trying to define it than. Can I give my 2 cents on that?
Let's hear it.
On what I see?
Yeah.
Mobile device management, data access, I think can often kind of hit against the core principles around compliance and security. I think we're seeing a lot of customers looking at virtual desktop and cloud desktop services as a way to really lock data into the data center and try to keep it off of laptops and mobile devices and things like that. I think we're seeing a lot of the crown jewels from the data side being well protected, and we just launched our connected health cloud product, and crown jewels, it's where it goes. But the sort of forces of doing big data and doing analytics and looking at data sanitation and masking and all the things you want from a developer perspective, how do you go bridge the developer into this world that's super secure? And I think there's a lot of just sort of pulls really in both of those directions that we're looking at unique ways to try to solve for. What's great though is from a data masking technology perspective, you've got Informatica that's doing some great stuff. You've got the Hadoop technology that's got some of that built into. So I mean, I think there's the software developer world out there is starting to really understand how to reduce the threat, I guess, of data loss from a developer perspective and from a big data perspective.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've gotten a lot of really interesting information today. We've come very close to defining what the cloud is. So I think a few more of these sessions and we'll be right there. But I just wanted to thank our panelists for coming together and providing this vibrant discussion, and really appreciate all your thoughts. Let's give them all a big hand.